Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Incredible Hulk 2, cover dated July of 1962. This issue marks the first appearance of the evil alien race, the Toadmen, and was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Jack Kirby. Our issue opens up in a dark swamp as a state trooper is investigating an unusual rustling off of the highway. While he expects to find nothing more than a mischievous teenager or a drunken vagrant, he's shocked to discover that trotting through the murky water is none other than the Incredible Hulk. To him and just about everyone else, he's a mindless rampaging monster. And they have good reason to believe this, as the Hulk's first instinct is to begin furiously chasing the trooper. Thus the lawman immediately flees to his cruiser and begins racing to warn the nearest town. So the Hulk pursues him there and is confronted by a truck driver who tries to ram him with his vehicle. But this does nothing to stop him, as he absorbs the collision like a brick wall and begins attacking the driver. But before he can do any serious harm, a group of troopers arrive on the scene and try to tackle him. While they of course fail to bring him down, they succeed in shifting his attention away from the driver. But now they're his targets, and he uproots a nearby streetlight and begins swinging it at them like a giant bat. The only thing that finally manages to stop his rampage is the pleading of the young Rick Jones. He's the Hulk's only friend, and the person responsible for his creation. The Hulk was once an atomic scientist named Bruce Banner, who specialized in the study of gamma radiation. He was contracted by the U.S. Army to build an experimental gamma bomb, and once ready, it was detonated on an isolated desert testing range. But Rick Jones, a clueless and careless teenager, accidentally stumbled onto the range just as the detonation countdown began. Risking his own life, Banner rushed onto the range and ushered Jones to safety. But thanks to the meddling of a Soviet spy, the bomb detonated while he was exposed. Thus he was bathed in a torrent of gamma radiation, but miraculously, he survived. Except that he was a changed man, as now, at every sunset, he transforms into the Incredible Hulk. Unlike himself, the Hulk is a savage brute who despises mankind, and openly yearns for its destruction. Thus it's no surprise that his favorite pastime is rampaging through city streets, and generally causing mayhem wherever he goes. The only thing that's known to soothe his anger is the pleading of Rick Jones, and the only thing that returns him to normal is the break of dawn. That brings us back to the story at hand, as mornings come, and the Hulk's been transformed back into Bruce Banner. While he's grateful for Rick leading him away from the town, he's now begging the teenager to abandon him, as he fears that the Hulk will one day turn on his only friend. But Rick refuses to ditch him, as he feels obligated to help him after he saved his life from the gamma bomb. Banner reluctantly accepts this, but before we can see any more of the pair, the issue suddenly shifts focus to an alien spaceship approaching Earth. It's piloted by a race known as the Toadmen, and they've come to the planet to conquer it. While they're confident that an invasion would be a success, they don't want to waste unnecessary resources on a primitive planet. Thus they've decided to kidnap and interrogate the world's most brilliant scientific mind to ascertain how advanced humanity really is. But for now, let's shift focus back to Banner and Jones, who are walking into the desert with a load of scientific equipment. But they've just been flagged down by Thunderbolt Ross and his daughter Betty. The former is an army general who'd overseen Banner's gamma bomb experiment. The two worked closely on this project, and neither grew to like the other. Ross especially detests Banner, as he sees him as an ineffectual weakling. Meanwhile, his daughter Betty quite likes him, and even harbors feelings for him. She's thus elated to see that he's safe after the Hulk's latest rampage, but Banner doesn't have time to catch up with her, so he wishes her well, and then leaves with Jones to an underground cave. Inside the cave is a large and sturdy outcropping, which not even the Hulk could break out of. Thus in order to keep others safe from the monster, Banner's decided to lock himself inside of it every night, and he's built a hydraulic door to seal himself in. It's 10 feet thick, and requires that Rick close it every night, and open it every morning, a responsibility that the teenager gladly accepts. So Banner prepares himself for a dark and lonely night, but before he can step in the chamber, he and Rick are suddenly pinned to the cave's wall, as if their bodies have been magnetized to it. It's the Toadmen, who've come to kidnap Banner, as apparently he's the world's most brilliant scientific mind. So they trap him and Jones in a magnetic stasis field, and then force the pair into their waiting spaceship. Once they're inside, it launches into orbit, and the Toadmen explain why they've been kidnapped. But they also offer a dire warning, for if Banner refuses to reveal humanity's level of advancement, they'll destroy cities, drain the oceans, and immobilize every person on the planet. Despite these threats, Banner still refuses to tell them anything. Rick cheers him on for this, and the Toad Men respond by jettisoning the teenager back to Earth, as after all, they don't really have a need for him. Luckily, they don't just dump him into the vacuum of space, but send him in an escape pod that lands safely. But back to Banner, who peers outside a window and realizes that the Toad Men's ship is passing by the dark side of Earth. Thus it's actually nighttime, and his transformation is imminent. Sure enough, it's triggered only moments later, and the Hulk wastes no time in tearing his way through the ship. A bewildered group of Toad Men try to halt his rampage, but they're no match for his strength, and he even manages to turn their own weapons against them. Thus, with their ship under his control, the Hulk realizes that he can use its advanced weaponry to destroy mankind. But before we can see him enact his revenge, the issue shifts focus to a U.S. anti-missile base, commanded by Thunderbolt Ross. His soldiers have just spotted the Toad Men's ship on their radar, and are under orders to shoot down any unidentified flying objects. Thus they launch a torrent of defensive missiles into space, and quickly bring the ship crashing down to Earth. Luckily, it lands not far from their base, so Ross and a group of soldiers head out to confront its occupants. But surprisingly, the only one to emerge from the wreckage is Banner, as apparently this area is still in daylight. Thus Ross can only assume, no matter how far-fetched it might sound, that Banner had been planning a sneak attack on his own country. So he places the scientist in custody, and leaves without even bothering to check inside the actual ship. But it wouldn't have mattered if he had, as the Toad Men, who'd survived the crash, quickly used their advanced weapons to escape underground. They then begin burrowing a path away from the crash site, and once free from prying eyes, emerge onto the surface and signal their waiting invasion force to attack Earth. But before we can see their conquest in action, the issue shifts focus back to Banner, who's being held in a maximum security prison within the missile base. Although Thunderbolt Ross only knows him to be a weak scientist, he's ordered his men to guard his cell day and night. The only one who's permitted to enter is Rick Jones, who then reminds his friend that he'll be able to escape soon enough, as even the Army's best prison can't hold the Hulk. But this is exactly what Banner fears, as although he wishes to be free, he doesn't want the Hulk to harm anyone in the process. But with that, the issue shifts focus to General Ross, who's just received word that an armada of alien spaceships is descending on Earth. It's of course the Toad Men, who've come to conquer the planet. But to announce their presence worldwide, they hijack every single TV and radio signal on Earth, and reveal that they've used massive magnets to dislodge the moon from its orbit, and are slowly inching it closer to Earth. Thus as the days pass by, cities around the world will be flooded by mile-high waves, until the moon's closeness will force the Earth off of its own orbit, and it'll begin hurtling uncontrollably into the vastness of space. While the Toad Men's invasion has just begun, even now, coastal cities are beginning to be overwhelmed by unnaturally high tides, and soon enough, deadly earthquakes will spring up under the pressure of the moon's proximity. But there is hope for humanity yet, as the Toad Men reveal that they'll reverse their magnets, but only if the entire planet surrenders to them. While world leaders wrestle with what to do, one of the few men who are unaware of the situation lies in his cell, dreading the coming nightfall. It's Banner. Or at least it was, as he's just transformed into the Hulk. Thus the brooding monster, as is his nature, bursts his way out of his prison cell, and immediately begins battling the missile base's soldiers. But they're of course helpless to stop his ensuing rampage, and flee to warn General Ross. Interestingly, the mention of that name enrages the Hulk. While he doesn't retain much of Banner's memories, he does recognize Ross as the one who'd imprisoned him. Thus he decides to crush him, and heads off towards his house, the location of which he also remembers from Banner. But when he arrives, he only finds his daughter Betty, who's naturally frightened by his presence, and thus lets out a terrified scream. Yet for some reason, General Ross is just outside his home with a squad of soldiers, and hearing his daughter shriek in terror, orders them to burst in and save her. But it seems that the Hulk wants to be alone with Betty, as he shoves them away as they try to enter through the front door. But General Ross isn't taking any chances with the safety of his daughter, and orders a tank to ram its way through the rear of the house. Thus it's cleared a path for him and his soldiers to enter, and interestingly enough, they're also joined by Rick Jones. So the teenager tries to calm the Hulk down as only he can, but the raging monster isn't receptive to his pleas, and ends up picking him up and hurling him away. Thus it's obvious that the Hulk cannot be reasoned with, so Ross orders his men to tackle him to the ground. But they, like the state troopers before them, are no match for the Hulk's inhuman strength, as he easily shakes them off, and then rushes out of the house with Betty in tow. And it turns out that he's faster than he seems, as he races into the wilderness and quickly loses Ross. While at this point the general can only pray that the Hulk doesn't harm his daughter, Rick thinks that he might still be able to stop him. So he heads out to Banner's remote laboratory, where he thinks the Hulk's fled to. And sure enough he's right, as the monster swiftly arrives there, and drops off Betty. While it's not clear why he's there, or what he wants from her, he does take a moment to espouse his hatred for humanity. But it's then that Rick bursts in, and begins pleading with the Hulk to let Betty go and do something about the Toad Men. But the Hulk doesn't care about humanity, and decides he's going to silence Rick for good. But before he can harm the teenager, they're both rocked by a sudden earthquake. Like the Toad Men had promised, the Earth is reeling from the moon's unnatural proximity. Thus the pair are knocked off balance, and unconscious. While it's not clear how long they're out for, by the time they awaken, it's already morning. Thus the Hulk's been transformed back into Bruce Banner, and he's quickly told of the Toad Men's invasion by Rick. Realizing that he may have a way to defeat them, he and Rick hurriedly race off, but not before resting Betty on a nearby couch, as she'd also been knocked out by the earthquake. But regardless, the two then head back to the missile base, where Banner had apparently constructed a giant gamma gun. He's going to shoot it at the Toad Men's magnets, in the hopes that its unpredictable energy will somehow repel them. But he'll need 60 seconds to start it up, meaning Rick will have to fend off Ross and his soldiers, who've just arrived and are trying to break their way in. But Rick's just a lowly teenager without any weapons or training, so he decides to pick up a nearby fire hose, and aims it squarely at the only entrance. Thus as the soldiers barge their way in, Rick turns on the hose and manages to repel them for a few seconds, which is enough time for Banner to activate the gamma gun. Thus it releases a discharge of radioactive energy into space, and amazingly, it strikes the Toad Men's magnets and reverses their pull. This luckily returns the moon to its natural orbit, and sends the Toad Men's armada hurtling into space uncontrollably. Thus the day is saved, and not daring to prosecute Earth's savior, Ross releases Banner, but remains suspicious of him. And he has good reason to, as the issue subsequently ends as we see Rick trap Banner in his underground dungeon for the night. And while the Hulk predictably emerges, Rick can release a sigh of relief, as thankfully, it manages to hold the raging monster. That concludes The Incredible Hulk 2, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, if a little cramped story. While I certainly thought that it was a fun and exciting issue, there was just a lot of stuff going on at once, and I'm not sure it did the best job of bouncing between different characters and events. It seemed that the focus was constantly being shifted from Banner, Hulk, Ross, and the Toad Men, and after a while, it just got a little confusing. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.